My mom left me this before she disappeared. I've been homeless for a week. A girl told a Hell's Angel the sky over the valley was still black when Tank Morrison turned his truck into the gravel lot behind Steel Horse Auto Repair. The clock on his dashboard read 5:30 in the morning. It was the same time he showed up every single day, rain or shine, hot or cold. Some things a man just didn't change. He killed the engine and sat for a second, listening to it tick as it cooled. The thermos of coffee on the seat beside him was still warm, steam curling out the little spout each time he cracked the lid. He liked this hour. The quiet of it. Before the phone started ringing and the guys started showing up with their complaints and their engine troubles and their stories from the night before. Just him, the dark, and the smell of oil and cold morning air. He grabbed the thermos and stepped out of the truck. Gravel crunched under his boots. The shop sat like a big black shadow against the purple sky, its sign out front dark since the lights hadn't kicked on yet. Tank was a big man, wide in the shoulders, with a gray beard and arms covered in ink he'd earned over 20 years of riding. He walked slow but steady, keys already jingling in his hand, mind already running through the day's list of jobs. A transmission for the Coleman truck, an oil change for that little Honda. Bear was supposed to come in early to help with the brakes on Unit 4. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He rounded the corner toward the back door, the one the crew used to bring in parts, and that's when he stopped cold. There was something there. A shape, curled up small against the door, right where the shadow of the building was thickest. For half a second his mind said dog, some stray that had wandered in looking for warmth. Then the shape moved, and he saw it wasn't a dog at all. It was a girl. She was folded up tight, knees pulled to her chest, a thin jacket wrapped around her that looked like it wasn't doing much against the cold. Her hair was a tangled mess, dark and hanging over her face. In her arms she held a duffel bag, gripped so hard against her chest that her knuckles looked pale even in the dim light. She was shaking. Whether it was from the cold or from fear, Tank couldn't tell. "Hey," he said, low and rough, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, you okay?" The girl's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, wild almost, the kind of scared Tank had seen before, on men who'd been in bar fights gone bad, on animals caught in traps. She scrambled back against the door like she was trying to disappear into it, the duffel bag coming up in front of her like some kind of shield. Whoa, whoa. Tank held up one hand, the other still holding his thermos, and took a slow step back. "I ain't gonna hurt you. This is my shop. I open up here every morning." She didn't say anything, just stared at him, breathing fast, her whole body coiled tight like she might bolt at any second. She looked young, real young. Maybe 15, 16, too young to be out here alone in the dark, curled up against a locked door in the cold. Tank set the thermos down slow on the ground beside him, showing her his empty hands. Then he crouched down, lowering himself to her level, knees popping the way they did more and more these days. He kept his voice quiet, the same voice he used on spooked dogs and scared kids at the shop when their daddy's truck wouldn't start and they thought the world was ending. "It's all right," he said. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here. I promise you that." She still didn't move, but her breathing slowed just a little. Tank studied her face in the gray light. Dirt smudged on one cheek. Lips cracked from the cold. eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept in longer than one night. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. For a long moment, she just looked at him, like she was trying to decide if she could trust the words coming out of her own mouth. Then, barely above a whisper, she said it. "Casey." And then her face crumpled, and she started to cry. Tank didn't move closer. Something in his gut told him that would be the wrong thing to do. Instead, he backed up a step, found an old plastic bucket turned upside down near the shop's back wall, and lowered himself onto it slow and easy, like a man settling in for a long wait. He set his thermos down on the concrete beside his boot. The steam curled up into the cold morning air and disappeared. He kept a few feet of distance between them. Enough space that she could breathe, enough space that she wouldn't feel cornered. Casey watched him the whole time, her eyes red and wet, her arms still wrapped tight around that duffel bag, like it was the only solid thing left in her world. She didn't say anything. She just watched him the way a stray dog watches a stranger who might have food, or might have a boot. Tank cleared his throat. "You don't have to talk to me," he said, his voice low and rough, but gentle in a way that surprised even him. "But I gotta ask you some things, okay? Just so I know how to help." She didn't answer. Her chin trembled. "How long you been out here?" he asked. "Out here, I mean. Sleeping outside." Casey's eyes dropped to the ground. For a long moment, Tank thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Then, in a voice so small it almost got lost in the wind, she said, "A week." Something cold settled in Tank's chest. A week. A whole week this girl had been sleeping outside. In this cold. Alone. A week, he repeated, keeping his tone even, careful not to let the shock show. "Where are you sleeping?" "Not just here, right?" "Bus station," she mumbled. "Under the bridge on 5th Street one night. There's a laundromat that stays open all night. I sat in there for a while too." She said it all like it was nothing, like she was reading off a grocery list, but Tank could hear the exhaustion underneath every word. The kind of tired that went bone deep. "Okay," Tank said softly. "Okay." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the stubble there, buying himself a second to think. "What about your folks, Casey? Your mom and dad, where are they?" That was when her face changed. The wall she'd been holding up cracked right down the middle. Her lips pressed together hard, like she was trying to keep something in, but it didn't work. Her shoulders started to shake. "My dad's not around," she said, her voice cracking. "Never has been. And my mom—" She stopped, swallowed hard. Her knuckles went white around the strap of her duffel bag. Tank stayed still. He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago, working with scared people, hurt people, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was just wait. Casey took a shaky breath. Then another. When she finally spoke again, her words came out flat and fast, like she'd practiced them, like she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. "My mom left me this before she disappeared," she said. "I've been homeless for a week." She reached into the front pocket of her duffel bag, her fingers trembling, and pulled out a small square of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft and fuzzy. She held it out to him with both hands, like it was something sacred. Tank looked at the paper for a second before he took it. His own hands, thick and scarred from decades of engine work, looked huge wrapped around that tiny folded note. He unfolded it carefully, like it might fall apart if he wasn't gentle enough. The handwriting inside was small and slanted, A woman's handwriting, hurried but careful. Tank's eyes moved across the words once, then again slower, like he didn't trust what he was seeing the first time. Find the man with the wrench tattoo on his left forearm. His name is Tank. He'll know what to do. Tell him Rosie sent you. The paper trembled in his grip. Tank stared at that name, Rosie, a name he hadn't heard spoken out loud in 15 years. A name he'd buried so deep in himself he thought it couldn't reach the surface anymore. His hands began to shake. The note trembled in Tank's thick fingers. He read it once. Then again. His lips moved slightly on the second pass, like he needed to feel the words in his mouth to believe they were real. Find the man with the wrench tattoo on his left forearm. His name is Tank. He'll know what to do. Tell him Rosie sent you. 15 years. 15 years since he'd heard that name spoken out loud, and now here it was, written in handwriting he still recognized, still felt in his chest like a fist closing around his heart. Casey shifted on the ground, pulling her knees up tighter. The silence stretched out, and with it, her fear grew. She'd seen this look before. On teachers. On caseworkers. On the man who ran the shelter that turned her away because they were full. It was the look people got right before they told you they couldn't help, right before they looked past you like you were smoke. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice cracking. "I shouldn't have came here. I'll go. I didn't mean to bother you. I didn't know where else. Casey." Tank's voice came out rough, thick with something she couldn't name. He wasn't looking at her. He was still staring at the note like it might disappear if he blinked. She stopped talking. Watched him. Waited for the words that would send her back out into the cold morning, back to wandering, back to being nobody's problem. Tank folded the note along its worn creases, the paper soft as cloth from being handled so many times. He held it like it was something alive, something that might break if he wasn't careful. "Your mama," he said slowly. "Where is she?" "Right now." "You don't know?" Casey shook her head, and her chin wobbled just slightly before she caught it and set her jaw hard, the same stubborn way she'd been doing all week to keep from crying in front of strangers. She left the note on the kitchen table. "With some money. Not a lot. I came home from school and she was just gone. No car. No note explaining nothing else. Just that." "A week," Tank repeated. "Yes, sir." The sir caught him off guard. Made him feel about 100 years old and about 12 at the same time. He looked at her then. Really looked. At the hollows under her eyes. The way her hand shook slightly, even though she was trying so hard to hold them still, the duffel bag she still hadn't let go of even sitting down. He thought of Rosie's laugh, the way she used to toss her hair back when she found something funny. The way she used to look at him like he was more than what everybody else saw when they looked at his leather vest and his tattoos and his motorcycle parked outside every bar in 3 counties. He thought about the fight. The one that ended it. 15 years of silence that he told himself didn't matter, that he'd moved past. That was ancient history. It hadn't been ancient history at all. It had just been waiting. Waiting for a girl with Rosie's same stubborn chin to show up outside his shop with a note that changed everything. Tank stood up from the bucket. His knees popped, and Casey flinched at the sudden movement, drawing back half an inch like she expected him to yell, to tell her to get lost, to call the cops on her for trespassing. Instead, he reached for the cuff of his left sleeve. "You said the note mentions a tattoo." he said. A wrench. On the left arm. Casey nodded, watching him now with something new in her eyes. Not quite hope. Not yet. But something close to it. Something fragile and unnamed. Like a bird testing a branch before deciding if it would hold its weight. Tank rolled the sleeve up past his elbow, slow and deliberate, revealing forearm skin weathered by sun and years, corded with muscle from decades of wrench work and long rides. And there, inked in faded black lines that had softened with age but never disappeared, was the wrench. Simple, old, exactly like she'd described. "That's me," Tank said quietly. "I'm Tank, and I knew your mama a long time ago." The sun broke fully over the rooftops behind them, spilling gold light across the gravel lot, across Casey's tired face, across the tattoo on Tank's arm that had just changed both their lives forever. "You're safe now," Tank said. "Come on inside. Let's get you something warm to eat." The bell over the shop door jingled soft as Tank pushed it open, the sound too cheerful for the heaviness sitting in his chest. He flipped on the lights, and the fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life one by one, throwing long shadows across the rows of tools and half-finished engines. "Watch your step," he said, moving a stack of tires out of Casey's path. "Place is a mess, but it's dry, and it's warm." Casey followed close behind him, her duffel bag still clutched tight against her chest like she wasn't sure yet if she'd need to run. Her eyes moved fast, taking in everything. The smell of motor oil. The row of motorcycles lined up like sleeping animals. The calendar on the wall, 3 months out of date. Tank led her past the main garage, through a narrow hallway, and stopped at a door near the back. He pushed it open. "This here's the break room," he said. "Ain't much, but it's yours. For now." The room was small and plain. A worn brown couch sat against one wall, a blanket folded over its arm. A mini fridge hummed in the corner, its top covered with old coffee mugs. There was a little bathroom off to the side, the kind with a shower stall barely big enough to turn around in. Casey stood in the doorway, not moving. "You don't gotta decide nothing right now," Tank said, watching her face carefully. You need a place to sleep that ain't a doorway. This is it. Until we figure out what comes next." She nodded slowly, still holding the bag like a shield. "Okay," she said quietly. Tank cleared his throat, suddenly unsure what else to say. He wasn't a man used to comforting anybody. He fixed engines. He gave orders. He didn't do this. "There's cereal in the cabinet," he said, pointing. "Milk in the fridge should still be good. Bathroom's got towels, might smell like motor oil, but it's clean." He paused. "You hungry?" Casey's stomach answered before she could, a low growl that made her cheeks go pink. "That's a yes," Tank said, almost smiling. He found a bowl in the cabinet, poured cereal, splashed milk over it, and set it down on the workbench just outside the break room, the closest thing to a table the shop had. Casey sat on the stool, still watchful, but she picked up the spoon and started eating like she hadn't eaten in days. Maybe she hadn't. Tank leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just wanted her to know someone was there, keeping watch, so she could eat without looking over her shoulder for once. That was when he heard the rumble of engines outside. Bear's bike pulled up first, followed by 2 more, the growl of the motors cutting through the quiet morning. Tank straightened, glancing at the clock. 6:30. Right on time, same as every day. The door opened, and Bear walked in first, helmet under one arm, followed by Whiskey and Dozer, still shaking off the morning chill. All three stopped dead in their tracks. Casey looked up from her bowl of cereal, spoon halfway to her mouth, eyes wide as three leather-clad bikers stared back at her like she was a ghost. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Bear's eyebrows shot up, and he looked over at Tank. Silent question written all over his face. "Bear," Tank said, walking over quickly, voice low. "Give me a minute." He steered Bear off to the side, near the tool cabinets, leaving Whiskey and Dozer to stand there awkwardly while Casey went back to eating, pretending not to notice the three grown men staring at her. "That a kid eating cereal at my workbench?" Bear asked under his breath, arms crossed over his broad chest. "Her name's Casey," Tank said. "Found her outside this morning. 16 years old, mama's gone missing, no place to go." Bear's jaw tightened. "Tank, you can't just take in every stray that shows up at the door." Tank pulled up his sleeve, showing Bear the wrench tattoo, the same one Casey's note had described. Bear's eyes flicked down to the ink, then back up to Tank's face, understanding slowly dawning. "She had a note," Tank said quietly. "From Rosie." Bear went still. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years either. "She's staying in the back room," Tank said. "Just for now. Until I figure out what's really going on." Bear looked over at Casey, who was watching them both carefully now, spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. Slowly, Bear nodded. Skeptical, but steady. The morning sun slanted through the shop windows, catching the dust in the air like tiny gold sparks. Casey sat on an overturned crate near the workbench, her cereal bowl empty now, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug Bear had given her without a word. Tank pulled up a stool across from her, careful to keep some distance. He didn't want to crowd her. Girls like Casey, he figured, had been crowded enough by life already. "So," he said, keeping his voice easy, the way he might talk to a spooked dog. "Tell me about your mom." Casey's eyes flicked up, then back down to the mug. "What about her? When'd you see her last?" She was quiet for a moment, like she was counting the days in her head. 8 days ago. She said she had to go somewhere. Said it was important." Casey's jaw tightened. "Said she'd be back soon. She say where?" "No." Casey shook her head. "She never said where. She just packed a bag, kissed my forehead, and told me to be brave." Her voice cracked a little on the last word, and she covered it by taking a sip from the mug, even though Tank could tell it was empty. Tank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Anything else? Anything she said that seemed strange?" Casey thought about it. "She told me if things got bad, I should come find you. She wrote your name down along with the tattoo. Made me memorize it too, just in case I lost the paper." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "I didn't understand why. I never even heard her mention you before that day." Tank's chest tightened at that, but he kept his face steady. "You got any other family? Grandparents, aunts, uncles? Anybody?" Casey shook her head slowly. "No, it's always been just me and Mom. She said her parents passed a long time ago, before I was born, and she never talked about a dad, so I never had one of those." She paused, glancing at him almost like she was studying his face for the first time. "She never mentioned family from your side, either, just you." Tank filed that away, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "Casey, I gotta ask you something, and I need you to think hard before you answer. Did your mom seem different lately? Sick, maybe? Tired all the time?" Anything like that? Casey's eyes widened slightly, like she hadn't expected the question. But then she nodded. Yeah, actually, she'd been real tired for months. She lost weight too. She kept saying it was just stress from work, but she never used to sleep so much before. She hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. She started locking her phone. She never used to do that. And she'd get all these calls she wouldn't answer in front of me. She'd just step outside. Secretive, Tank said. Half to himself. Yeah, Casey said, nodding again. Secretive. Sick and secretive. That's what it was like the last few months. Like she was hiding something big. Something she didn't want me to know. Tonk sat back, rubbing a hand over his jaw, feeling the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. Somewhere in the back of the shop, he could hear Bear moving around, pretending not to listen, though Tonk knew better. Bear had ears like a bat when it came to things that mattered. Casey, Tonk said finally, I'm not going to call anybody yet. Not social services, not anybody like that. Not until I've had a chance to look into this myself. Casey's head snapped up, eyes wide, a flicker of fear crossing her face. You're not going to send me away? No, Tonk said firmly. Not today. Maybe not ever, if I can help it. But I need some time to figure out where your mom went and why. Can you trust me on that? Casey studied him for a long moment, her guarded eyes searching his face for any sign of a lie. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay, she whispered. I'll trust you. Tank's truck smelled like motor oil and coffee, an old smell that had soaked into the seats over 20 years. Casey sat with her duffel bag on her lap, holding it the way she'd been holding it since Tank first saw her, like it might get up and walk away if she let go. You don't have to hold that so tight, Tank said, eyes on the road. It ain't going anywhere. Casey loosened her grip a little. Not much, but a little. Where are we going? She asked. Thrift store on 5th Street. Marge runs it. Good prices, and she don't ask questions. Tank glanced over. You need clothes. More than what you got in that bag, I'm guessing. Casey looked out the window instead of answering. That was answer enough. They drove in silence for a while, the truck rumbling under them, and Tank found himself searching for something to say. He wasn't used to talking to teenagers, wasn't used to talking to anybody much these days, if he was honest. The guys at the shop didn't need conversation, just grunts and nods and the occasional joke about somebody's ex-wife. You like music? He finally asked, reaching for the radio dial. Depends what kind. Classic rock, mostly some blues. He turned the dial, and an old Creedence song crackled through the speakers. This all right? Casey shrugged, but Tank saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Almost a smile. It's fine. High praise, Tank said, and for the first time, Casey actually laughed. Just a small one, barely there, but it was real. The thrift store was a squat building with a faded sign and a bell that jingled over the door. Marge, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked up from the register and raised an eyebrow at Tank. Well, look what the cat dragged in, she said. And who's this? Friend of the family, Tank said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Needs some clothes. Whatever you got in her size. Marge didn't ask more questions. She just nodded toward the racks. Girls' section is in the back, left of the shoes. Take your time. Casey moved through the racks slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything. Tank stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, feeling strange and out of place in a way he hadn't felt in years. You can pick more than one thing, he said. Get some real stuff. shirts, pants, whatever you need. I don't have money, Casey said quietly. Didn't ask you for any. Casey looked at him for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out the catch. There was always a catch, her eyes seemed to say. But she picked out a few shirts, a pair of jeans, a warm hoodie the color of rust. Tank added a toothbrush, some soap, and a hairbrush to the small pile without being asked. At the register, Marge rang it all up and gave Tank a look that said she had questions, but she kept them to herself. Tank paid in cash and carried the bags out to the truck himself. Thank you, Casey said once they were back on the road. It came out stiff, like she wasn't used to saying it. Don't mention it, Tank said. Then, after a pause, You doing okay? I'm fine. That ain't what I asked. Casey didn't answer that one. Tank let it go. Back at the shop, the garage bay doors were open, letting in the afternoon light. Bear was leaning over the engine of an old Ford pickup, scratching his head, while the truck's owner, a nervous-looking man named Pete, hovered nearby. I don't know, man, Bear was saying. Runs rough, idles funny. Could be a dozen things. Casey, still holding her new bags, wandered close to look. She tilted her head, studying the engine from a few feet away like she was reading a book. It's your carburetor, she said. Float's probably stuck. That's why it's flooding when you idle. Bear looked up, startled. Pete blinked at her. Tank froze halfway through unloading the truck bags, staring at the girl. Say that again? Bear said. Float valve, Casey repeated, like it was obvious. You can hear it. Little sputter, then it catches. Classic flooding sound. Bear checked, popped the carburetor cover, and sure enough, there it was. He looked at Casey like she'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat. How the hell do you know that? He asked. Casey shrugged, suddenly shy again. I don't know. Just do. Tank stared at her, something stirring in his chest he couldn't quite name. A flicker of curiosity, sharp and strange, like a puzzle piece sliding almost into place. Get some rest, he said finally, clearing his throat. Back room set up. Real bed, clean sheets. Casey nodded, and for the first time in a week, she slept soundly through the whole night. The morning sun had barely cleared the roofline of Steel Horse Auto Repair when Tank sat down at his cluttered desk in the back office, a mug of black coffee steaming beside him. He'd been up since 4, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment above the shop, thinking about Rosie, thinking about the note. Thinking about 15 years of silence that suddenly didn't feel like enough distance at all. He pulled out an old address book, its leather cover cracked and soft from years of use. Half the numbers in it belonged to men who'd changed their lives 3 times over since he'd last called them. But some things in the biker world never changed. Loyalty ran deep. Memory ran deeper. He started dialing. Frankie. Yeah, it's Tank. Long time. He rubbed his forehead. Listen, I need you to ask around. Rosie Reeves. You remember her? Yeah, that Rosie. I'm trying to find out if anyone's heard from her. Anything, even a whisper. Frankie didn't know anything, but he promised to ask. Tank moved down the list. Old friends from 3 states over. A trucker named Diesel, who drove routes up and down the eastern seaboard and knew every truck stop, diner, and motel between here and the Canadian border. A woman named Patches, who used to run with a different chapter but kept tabs on everybody through sheer force of gossip. Each call started the same way. Each call ended with a promise to keep an ear out. Out in the front office, Casey sat cross-legged on a rolling chair, sorting through a drawer of invoices with Dottie standing over her, pointing out which ones needed filing and which ones needed shredding. "You're a natural," Dottie said, smiling as she handed Casey another stack. Bear couldn't organize his way out of a paper bag, God bless him, but this office looked like a tornado hit it before you showed up. Casey almost smiled. It was a small thing, sorting papers, but it felt good to have something to do with her hands that wasn't just waiting. Waiting for someone to tell her to leave. Waiting for the ground to shift again like it always did. "Can I ask you something?" Casey said, not looking up from the invoices. "Course, honey. Is he a good guy? Like, really?" Dottie set down the stack of papers she was holding and looked at Casey for a long moment. "He's one of the best men I know," she said. "Gruff as an old bear, sure, but his heart's in the right place. Always has been." Casey nodded slowly, like she was filing that answer away with the invoices, deciding where it belonged. Back in the office, Tank's phone buzzed on the desk. He grabbed it before the second ring, hoping, "Yeah, Diesel. Talk to me." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that made Tank's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. "Tank, listen, I asked around like you said. Took some digging, but a buddy of mine drives routes past Cedar Ridge Medical Center over in Millbrook. Says he remembers seeing a woman matching Rosie's description about 2 weeks back. Except she wasn't checking in under her real name." Tank's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean, not her real name?" "She used the name Rose Kessler. My buddy only remembers because he thought it was strange. A woman that age checking in alone. No family with her. No visitors since." Diesel's voice dropped lower. "Tank, Cedar Ridge ain't just a medical center. It's got a hospice wing attached to it." The words hit Tank like a fist to the chest. Hospice. The word rattled around in his skull, refusing to make sense at first, and then making too much sense all at once. "You're sure?" Tank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pretty sure." "I'm sorry, man." Tank sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear long after Diesel had said his goodbyes and hung up. The coffee in front of him had gone cold. Outside the office door, he could hear Casey laughing softly at something Dottie said. A small, bright sound that didn't belong in the same world as the word hospice. All this time, he'd been picturing Rosie as some woman who ran off, who couldn't handle her own daughter, who left a 16-year-old kid to fend for herself out of carelessness or cruelty. But that wasn't it at all. Rosie hadn't abandoned Casey. Rosie was dying. And she'd hidden herself away under a fake name so that nobody, not even her own daughter, would know. Tank's face had gone the color of old ash. He sat there, staring at the phone in his hand, and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him that he wasn't ready to make. Tank did not sleep that night. He lay on top of the covers in his small room above the shop, staring at the ceiling fan going around and around, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosie's face the way it used to be. Young, laughing, her hand tangled in his the summer they'd spent riding back roads with no place to be. Then that face would blur and change into something he didn't want to picture. Thin, pale, sick, hospice. The word kept landing in his chest like a fist. He got up around midnight and went down to the shop floor, walking between the cars up on lifts, running his hand along a fender out of habit more than purpose. The smell of oil and metal usually settled him. Tonight, it didn't do a thing. He thought about Casey asleep down the hall in the spare room, That duffel bag she still kept packed by the door like she expected to have to run again at any moment. He thought about the way her whole face had opened up 2 days ago when she'd figured out what was wrong with the timing belt on Dottie's car before Bear had even popped the hood. She had a gift. She had grit. She did not deserve what he was carrying around in his gut right now. If he walked in there and said the words out loud, "Your mom is dying," he would break something in that girl that might never go back together. He had seen what hard news did to people. He had watched grown men fall apart from less. He needed to be sure first, needed to see it with his own eyes before he put that kind of weight on a 16-year-old's shoulders. Bear found him at 3 a.m, sitting on an overturned bucket by the garage door, staring out at the dark parking lot. "You look like hell," Bear said, lowering himself onto a stool across from him with a groan. "Feel like it, too. You gonna tell her?" Tank rubbed a hand down his face. "Not yet. Not until I know more. Not until I see Rosie myself and find out what's really going on. I'm not gonna hand that kid a broken heart based on second-hand information from a trucker 3 states away." Bear nodded slowly. "That's fair. But you gotta tell her something. She ain't stupid, Tank. She's gonna know you're up to something." "I know." Tank looked down at his hands, at the wrench tattoo faded blue-green against his skin. "I'll figure out the words." He didn't sleep after that either. He just waited for the sun. By the time morning light came slanting through the shop windows, Tank had made up his mind. He found Casey in the front office, sitting cross-legged in the old office chair with a textbook open on her knees, though her eyes weren't really on the page. Dottie had left a mug of hot chocolate steaming by her elbow untouched. "Hey," Tank said, leaning in the doorway. Casey looked up fast, the way she always did, like she was bracing for something. "I got a lead," he said. "On your mom." Her whole body went still. "What kind of lead?" "Nothing solid yet. Just something I need to check out myself." He kept his voice even, steady, the same tone he used on a spooked dog or a customer who'd just gotten bad news about a totaled engine. "Gonna take me a few days. I need you to stay here at the shop. Dottie and Bear will look after you. You'll be safe." Casey searched his face the way she did when she was trying to read an engine problem, just from the sound of it. "You know something you're not telling me." It wasn't a question. Tank held her gaze and did not look away, but he did not answer it either. "I'll tell you everything I can, when I know for sure. I promise you that much." She studied him a moment longer, jaw tight, arms crossing over her chest in that defensive way she had. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll stay put." But her eyes did not look convinced. They looked like she already knew, somewhere deep down, that whatever Tank was about to go find was going to change everything. Morning light came through the shop windows in long gold stripes, and Casey learned to love that light. It meant another day at Steel Horse. It meant she was still safe. She found her place slowly, the way a stray cat learns which porch will always have food. First it was small jobs. Dottie showed her how to count bolts and washers into little plastic bins, how to read the faded labels on boxes of spark plugs. Casey liked the order of it. Everything had a place. Nothing here disappeared without a reason. "You're fast," Dottie said one morning, watching Casey sort a whole shelf of filters in half the time it usually took Bear. "Faster than my husband, and don't you dare tell him I said that." Casey almost smiled. Almost, By the second day, Bear started letting her hang around the bay while he worked. He talked while he wrenched, explaining things without being asked. The way some men do when they love a thing so much they can't help but share it. "See this here," he said, pointing at a greasy engine block with a finger like a sausage. "This is the heart of the whole car. You mess this up, nothing else matters." Casey leaned in. She didn't know why, but the smell of oil and metal felt like something she recognized, like a song she'd heard before but couldn't place. When Bear handed her a wrench and told her to try loosening a bolt herself, her hands moved like they already knew the way. She caught the surprise on his face and felt a small flush of pride. "You've done this before?" he asked. "No," Casey said. "It just feels right." Bear studied her a second too long, like he saw something there he wasn't expecting. But he didn't say anything else. He just nodded and let her keep working. The days took shape after that. Mornings with Dottie and the inventory. Afternoons with Bear and the engines. Evenings sitting at the front counter with her homework spread out, the guys coming and going, calling her kid or Case like she'd always been there. Nobody asked her hard questions. Nobody looked at her like she was broken. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Casey let her shoulders come down from around her ears. She even laughed. It happened on Wednesday, when one of the younger bikers, a skinny guy named Riggs, tried to show off by revving an engine that wasn't bolted in right, and the whole thing rattled loose and nearly fell into his lap. He yelped like a scared cat and jumped back so fast he knocked over a whole rack of tools. The sound that came out of Casey surprised even her, a real laugh, loud and unstoppable, and once it started she couldn't make it stop. Bear laughed too, so hard he had to sit down on a stool and wipe his eyes. "Girls got a laugh like a shotgun," he said. "Never heard nothing like it." That night, Tank watched from his office window as Casey walked back toward the spare room, still smiling to herself. Something in his chest ached in a way he didn't have words for. She was starting to belong here. Whatever happened with Rosie, whatever truth waited at the end of his search, this much was already true. This girl had found something worth holding on to. By Friday, Bear had an idea. And once Bear had an idea, there was no stopping it. He rolled the big garage door up wide open and dragged out the old grill from the back lot. Dottie showed up with bags of buns and a cooler of soda. Someone strung up a line of Christmas lights between two motorcycle lifts, even though it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. By 6 o'clock, the whole bay smelled like charcoal smoke and grilled onions, and half the chapter had shown up, leaning on their bikes, laughing, telling stories too loud. "What's all this?" Casey asked, standing in the doorway, blinking at the string lights. "This," Bear said, handing her a paper plate piled high with a burger and chips, "is us welcoming you proper. You're one of ours now, kid." Casey looked around at all those rough, tattooed faces, all of them smiling at her like she mattered, like she was wanted. Her throat tightened so fast she barely got out a thank you before she turned and walked quickly toward the little bathroom near the office, locking the door behind her, pressing her back against it, as the tears came all at once. Hot and sudden and impossible to stop. Tank pulled his truck into the parking lot of Meadowbrook Hospice Care just as the sun was starting to sink behind the pine trees. 3 towns over. 2 hours of driving, and he had spent most of that time saying nothing, just letting the road hum beneath the tires, while his mind turned over the name Bear's trucker friend had given him. Rose Callahan. Not Rosie Reeves. A false name. She'd been hiding, and she'd been hiding good. He put the truck in park, but didn't turn off the engine right away. His hands stayed on the wheel, gripping it the way a man grips something to keep himself steady. The building in front of him didn't look like what he expected. He'd pictured something cold, something that smelled like bleach and bad news. Instead, it was a low brick building with flower beds out front, yellow and purple pansies planted in neat little rows, a wooden bench under a maple tree where an old man sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. A sign near the entrance read Meadowbrook Hospice Care in soft green letters, and underneath it, smaller, Comfort. Dignity, peace. Tank felt his chest tighten just reading those words. Hospice. That word meant something specific, and he knew what it meant, even if some part of him had been trying not to know it since Bear first said the address out loud. He killed the engine. The truck ticked as it cooled. Tank sat there with his hands still on the wheel, staring at the building like it might come apart if he looked at it too long. 15 years. 15 years since he'd heard Rosie's laugh, since he'd smelled her perfume, since he'd let her walk out of his life because he was too proud and too scared to chase after her. 15 years he'd told himself it was fine, that she'd moved on, that maybe she was somewhere happy with somebody who wasn't married to a motorcycle club and all its danger and demands. He hadn't pictured this. He hadn't let himself picture anything, if he was honest. A minute passed. Then 5. Then 10. Tank watched a nurse walk out to her car in pale blue scrubs, watched her fish for her keys, watched her drive away. He watched the light change from gold to gray as clouds rolled over the sun. His hand found the door handle twice and pulled back twice, like a man testing water that might be too hot. "Come on, Morrison," he muttered to himself, the old nickname his club brothers used, the one that made him sound tougher than he felt right now. "You've walked into worse than this." But he hadn't. Not really. He'd walked into bar fights and police stations and hospital waiting rooms after brothers went down on the highway. He'd walked into funerals for men he loved like blood. But this was different. This was walking toward the woman who'd once been the best thing in his life, knowing that whatever waited behind those doors was going to break something open in him that he'd kept locked tight for a decade and a half. 20 minutes. That's how long he sat there, before his hand finally turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The air outside smelled like cut grass and rain coming. Tank walked toward the entrance slow, like a man walking toward a courtroom instead of a hospital, his boots heavy on the pavement. Inside, the lobby was quiet and carpeted, softer than he expected, with a fish tank bubbling in the corner and framed photos of sunsets on the walls. A woman at the front desk looked up at him, taking in the leather vest, the gray in his beard, the wrench tattoo peeking out from his rolled sleeve. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle in that practiced hospice way. Tank cleared his throat. "I'm looking for a patient." Rose Callahan. The woman's fingers moved over her keyboard. She studied the screen for a moment, and Tank held his breath without meaning to. "Yes," she said finally. "Miss Callahan is here. She's under hospice care." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Late stage. Are you family?" Tank's throat went tight. "Old friend," he managed. The nurse studied him a moment longer, then nodded, like something in his face told her this mattered. "I'll take you back. She's having a decent day today." Tank followed her down a hallway lined with soft lighting and quiet doors, his boots the only heavy sound in a place built for gentleness. His heart pounded harder with every step. The nurse stopped outside a door near the end of the hall, gave him a small nod, and walked away to give him privacy. Tank stood there. His hand rose toward the handle and froze. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Tank's whole body went still. Rosie lay in the hospital bed by the window, and for a moment, Tank could not make his brain match the woman in front of him with the Rosie he remembered. The Rosie he knew had been full of fire, dark hair always falling loose from a ponytail, laugh lines carved deep from grinning too much. This woman was small against the white sheets. Her hair had thinned to wisps. Her skin looked like paper stretched too tight over bone. Tubes ran from her arm to a machine that beeped steady and slow. But her eyes were still Rosie's eyes. And when they landed on him, they lit up like someone had flipped a switch after 15 years of darkness. "Tank," she whispered. Her voice cracked on his name, like she hadn't said it out loud in a long time and forgot how heavy it would feel coming out. He couldn't move. His hand was still on the door handle, knuckles white. Everything in him wanted to run, and everything in him wanted to cross the room in 2 steps and gather her up like she weighed nothing. Because she looked like she did. Rosie. That was all he could manage. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached one thin hand toward him, fingers trembling. "You came," she said. "I didn't know if you would. I didn't know if you were still around." Tank finally moved. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and sat down heavy in the plastic chair beside her bed, taking her hand in both of his like it was something fragile he might break. Her skin was cool and dry, but her grip, weak as it was, held on tight. "Course I came," he said, his voice rough. "Rosie, what happened to you?" She let out a breath that shook. "Cancer," she said simply. "Started in my lungs, spread everywhere else before anybody caught it." She tried to smile, but it wobbled and fell apart. Funny thing about waiting too long to go to a doctor. By the time you go, there's not much left to do. Tank's jaw tightened so hard it ached. "How long you known?" 4 months. Her eyes dropped to their joined hands. "I found out and I panicked, Tank. I sat in my car in the parking lot of that clinic for 2 hours and I couldn't stop shaking." She looked back up at him, and now the tears spilled over, tracking down her thin cheeks. "All I could think about was Casey. Watching me get smaller, watching me get weaker every single day until I wasn't her mom anymore, just some sick woman in a bed. I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't let her watch that. Rosie." His voice broke on her name. "I know it was wrong," she said, the words tumbling out now, like she'd been holding them in for months and the dam had finally cracked. "I know I should have told her. I know I should have let her say goodbye the right way. But every time I tried to imagine telling her, I saw her face and I couldn't. I'm her mother. I'm supposed to protect her, not break her heart with my own eyes." "So you sent her to me," Tank said quietly. Rosie nodded, more tears falling. "You were the only one I trusted, Tank. 15 years. And you were still the only person I could think of who wouldn't turn her away. Who would keep her safe no matter what." She squeezed his hand as hard as her weak fingers could manage. "I know I had no right to ask that of you after everything. After how things ended between us. But I didn't have anybody else. I didn't know what else to do." Tank felt something in his chest crack wide open, 15 years of hurt and distance and unanswered questions dissolving into something simpler. She hadn't left him behind. She hadn't stopped trusting him. She had been drowning, alone, and she'd reached for the one thing she still believed in. "Rosie, look at me," he said. And she did, her eyes red and swimming. "You did right. You hear me? You did right by her." "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "There's nothing to be sorry for." Tank tightened his grip on her hand, steady and sure. "I forgive you. All of it. Whatever you think you did wrong, I forgive you." Tank pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavy, the way he did after a long day at the shop. His hands, big and scarred from years of engine work, rested on his knees. He didn't know where to start, so he just looked at her. "You look tired, Rosie," he said. It wasn't the right thing to say, but it was true. She let out a small laugh that turned into a cough. That's one word for it. For a while they just sat there, letting the quiet settle between them. The machine by her bed beeped softly. Outside the window, the sky was turning gray with morning. "I thought about you a lot," Tonk finally said. "More than I told anyone." "Me too." Rosie's eyes were wet. Every single day, Tonk, he shook his head slowly. "I was stupid back then. Thought the club had to come before everything. Thought if I gave you less of myself, it would hurt less when things went bad." "You didn't have to explain yourself," she whispered. "I was just as stubborn. I wanted you to choose me over all of it. I never should have made you pick." "There wasn't supposed to be a choosing," he said. "That was my mistake. I let my pride build a wall between us instead of just talking to you." Rosie squeezed his hand, her grip weaker than he remembered, but still there. "We were both prideful fools. Two grown people who loved each other and couldn't say the right words at the right time." Tank looked down at their joined hands. "And then you found out you were carrying Casey." "I didn't know how to tell you," Rosie admitted. "By the time I was sure, we were already broken apart. I thought you'd feel trapped. Like I was forcing something on you." "I would have stayed," Tank said, his voice rough. "You know that. Even back then, I would have stayed." "I know that now," Rosie whispered. "I think some part of me always knew." "But fear makes you do strange things, Tank. It makes you build stories in your head about what people will do. And then you believe those stories more than you believe the people." Tank let out a long breath. 15 years. That's a long time to believe a story. "It is," Rosie agreed softly. "And I'm sorry for every single year of it." They talked through the morning light creeping across the floor, filling in the empty spaces of all those lost years. Rosie told him about raising Casey alone, the two of them moving from place to place, always scraping by but never giving up. Tank told her about the shop, about Bear and Dottie and the brothers who'd become his family when he thought he'd lost his only shot at one. Then, Rosie went quiet, and Tank could see something shift in her face. Her fingers tightened around his. "Tank," she said, her voice trembling now. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Anything? Does she hate me?" The words came out broken, like they'd been sitting in her chest for weeks, waiting to escape. For leaving her like that. For disappearing without saying goodbye. "Does Casey hate me?" Tank leaned forward, holding her hand in both of his now. "Rosie, that girl has been scared and confused and hurt. But hate you? No, she's got your note memorized. She carries it like it's the only thing keeping her steady." Rosie's chin quivered. "I'm going to bring her here." Tank said firmly. Today, as soon as I can. She needs to see you, Rosie, and you need to see her. You promise? Rosie asked, her voice barely a whisper. I promise, Tank said. I'll go get her right now. Rosie broke then, the sobs shaking her thin shoulders, but they weren't sobs of grief. They were sobs of relief, of gratitude so deep it had nowhere else to go but out through her tears. Tank stayed a moment longer, smoothing back a strand of her hair, before he stood and made his way to the door. I'll be back soon, he said. With her, he walked out into the hallway, leaving Rosie there crying into her hands, and headed for his bike. The sun was already sinking behind the water tower when Tank pulled his bike into the lot behind Steel Horse Auto Repair. His legs felt like lead climbing off the seat. His heart felt heavier than that. He saw her, before she saw him. Casey was sitting on the back step by the shop door, knees pulled up to her chest, exactly the way she'd been sitting the morning he first found her. Only this time, she wasn't sleeping. She was watching the road, waiting. The second she spotted his headlight cutting through the dusk, she shot to her feet. You found something, she said. It wasn't a question. You've been gone all day, Tank. You never leave the shop for a whole day. What happened? Did you find her? Tank pulled off his helmet slowly, giving himself a second to find the right words. There weren't any right words. There was only the truth, and the truth was going to hurt her no matter how carefully he handed it over. Let's go sit down, he said. Inside, Casey's face went pale. That's what people say before they tell you something bad. Casey, just tell me now. Please, I can't wait one more second, Tank. I've been waiting a week. Inside, Tank said again, gentler this time, and something in his voice made her follow him without another word. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and motor oil, same as always. Tank pulled out one of the folding chairs at the little table and waited until Casey sat across from him. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs like she was trying to hold herself together. Your mom didn't leave you because she stopped loving you, Tank started. He figured the most important thing needed to come first. I need you to hear that before anything else. She loves you more than anything in this world. That never stopped. Not for 1 second. Casey's eyes filled fast. Then why? Why would she just disappear like that? Why would she leave a note and vanish? Tank took a breath. She's sick, Casey, real sick. Cancer, it's bad, and it's been bad for a while now, and she didn't know how to tell you. The words landed like a physical blow. Casey's whole body seemed to fold inward, like something had been knocked loose in her chest. She's dying? Tank didn't sugarcoat it. He'd promised himself on the ride home he wouldn't. Casey deserved the truth. All of it. Straight and clear. Yeah, she is. She's in a hospice place, about 3 towns over. They're taking care of her there. For a moment, Casey just sat there, frozen, like her body hadn't caught up to what her ears had heard. Then it broke loose all at once, a sob that came from somewhere deep and old, someplace that had been holding its breath for a very long time. She didn't leave because of me, Casey choked out. She didn't hate me. She didn't just walk away. No. Tank said firmly. Never. She was trying to protect you. She thought if she told you, you'd have to watch her get sicker and sicker, and she couldn't stand the thought of putting you through that. She thought she was doing the right thing. Casey wiped at her face with the back of her hand, tears coming faster than she could catch them. That's so stupid. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. I would have stayed. I would have taken care of her. She should have just told me. I know, Tank said quietly. I told her the same thing today. Casey's shoulders shook. Relief and grief were tangled together so tight inside her that she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. Her mother hadn't stopped loving her. But her mother was dying, and there was no fixing that, no note or apology or promise that could change it. I want to see her, Casey said, her voice cracking wide open. Tank, I need to see her. Please, please, can you take me? Please. Tank reached across the table and took her small, trembling hand in his rough, scarred one. Tomorrow, he said. I promise you, tomorrow, I'll take you to her myself. The morning came up gray and cool, with a thin mist sitting over the parking lot of Steel Horse Auto Repair. Tank hadn't slept much. He'd spent most of the night sitting on his porch, staring at nothing, thinking about Rosie's face when he'd found her. Thinking about Casey's face when he'd told her. He walked into the shop a little before 7, expecting the usual quiet. Instead, he stopped in the doorway, keys still in his hand. The lot was full of motorcycles. Chrome caught the early light in long silver streaks. Leather vests, some patched and faded, some newer, stood in clusters between the bikes. Bear was there, arms crossed, standing near the front like he'd been waiting for Tank to show up and say something. Dottie stood beside him, holding a thermos of coffee like she meant business. What is this? Tank asked, though some part of him already knew. Bear shrugged, but his eyes were serious. Word travels. Tank guys heard about Rosie. Heard about the girl. Didn't feel right. You two driving out there alone. Tank looked past him. He counted heads without meaning to. A dozen. Maybe more. Rusty and Diesel from the chapter up in Marlow. Pete Vance, who hadn't ridden with them regular in over a year on account of his knee. Even old Sam Kirkpatrick, who Tank hadn't seen since his wife's funeral 2 winters back. Tank's throat went tight. He wasn't a man who cried easy, hadn't in years, but something about all those faces, all those bikes lined up like a wall of steel and leather ready to stand between Casey and the whole hard world, it got to him. You didn't have to do this, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Didn't have to, Bear agreed. Wanted to. Casey came out of the shop a few minutes later, hair still damp from a shower, wearing the jacket Dottie had picked out for her the week before. She stopped dead when she saw the lot full of bikes, her eyes going wide and uncertain, the same guarded look she'd worn that first morning outside the shop door. What's going on? She asked, looking at Tank like she wasn't sure if this was good news or bad. Tank crouched down a little so he was eye level with her, the way he did when he wanted her to know he meant something serious. They're coming with us, all of them. So you don't have to do this feeling alone. Casey's chin wobbled, just slightly, before she caught it and pressed her lips together. That's a lot of guys, she said, trying for casual and missing by a mile. That's family, Bear said, stepping up beside her. Whether you like it or not, kid, you're stuck with us now. Dottie handed Casey a cup of hot chocolate, steam curling up into the cool morning air. Drink that. Long ride ahead. They loaded up not long after. Tank had decided, without much argument from anyone, that Casey would ride in his truck instead of on the back of a bike. It wasn't about her safety exactly, though that was part of it. It was about Rosie's face, if she could see them now, and knowing her daughter was warm and steady and not exposed to the wind and the road. The bikes formed up first, engines catching one after another in a rolling wave of thunder that rattled the windows of the shop. Tank pulled his truck in behind them. Casey buckled in the passenger seat, her duffel bag at her feet out of old habit, like she still couldn't quite believe she got to leave it behind for good. "You ready?" Tank asked. Casey looked out the windshield at the line of bikes ahead of them, chrome flashing, leather creaking, a dozen men who had dropped everything that morning because a 16-year-old girl needed to see her dying mother one more time. Something in her chest loosened, just a little. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." The convoy pulled out onto the highway a few minutes later, engines roaring in formation. Two neat lines of motorcycles with Tank's truck riding safe in the middle of them. Casey watched the bikes on either side, the way they held their lines steady, mile after mile, like a wall nobody could break through. The sound of all those engines together didn't feel like noise anymore. It felt like something wrapping around her, solid and warm, carrying her the whole way to the hospice parking lot. The hospice room smelled like clean sheets and something else underneath, something medical and sharp that Casey couldn't name, but hated instantly. She stood in the doorway, with her hand pressed flat against the frame, feeling Tank's presence solid behind her like a wall of warm brick. "Go on, kid," Tank said quietly. "She's waiting for you." Casey's legs didn't want to move. Through the gap in the doorway she could see a bed, and in that bed, a shape that was supposed to be her mother, but didn't look like her at all. Rosie had always been the strongest person Casey knew, quick to laugh, quick to fight for what little they had. This woman looked small. Her skin had gone the color of paper left too long in the sun, and her hair, once thick and dark like Casey's, lay thin against the pillow. "Mom?" Rosie's eyes opened at the sound of that word, and for a moment, everything else in the room disappeared. Her lips curved into a smile that Casey recognized instantly, the same smile from 100 nights tucking her into bed, the same smile from birthday mornings and scraped knees. "There's my girl," Rosie whispered. Casey's feet finally obeyed her. She crossed the room in 3 steps and sank into the chair beside the bed, taking her mother's hand. It felt so light, like holding a bundle of dry sticks instead of the hand that used to braid her hair every morning before school. "You're so thin," Casey said, and hated how her voice cracked on the words. "I know, baby." Rosie squeezed her fingers, weak but certain. "I know I look different. But I'm still me in here. I'm still your mom." Tears burned hot behind Casey's eyes, and she blinked hard, trying to keep them back the way she'd taught herself to do on the streets, in shelters, in the back seat of strangers' cars. But this wasn't the street. This was her mother, and she didn't have to be tough here. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out, cracked and small, all the anger and fear and confusion of the last 2 weeks pouring into 6 words. "Why did you just leave me a note? Why didn't you let me help you?" Rosie's eyes filled with tears of her own. She lifted her free hand, trembling slightly, and brushed a strand of hair from Casey's face, the same way she'd done 1,000 times before. "Because I watched cancer eat away at my own mother when I was your age," Rosie said softly. "I remember every single day of it. The fear in her eyes. The way she couldn't hide the pain anymore. I remember how it broke something in me that never fully healed, watching someone I loved disappear one piece at a time. So you just left instead?" "I couldn't do that to you, Casey. I couldn't make you watch me die a little more every single day. I thought if I could just get you somewhere safe first, somewhere solid, then maybe you wouldn't have to carry that kind of pain." Rosie's voice broke. "I was wrong to do it that way. I see that now. I should have trusted you more. I should have trusted us." "I would have stayed," Casey said, the tears finally spilling over. "I would have taken care of you." "I know, baby, that's exactly why I couldn't let you." Rosie managed a small, sad laugh. "You've spent your whole life taking care of things. Taking care of me. Taking care of yourself when I couldn't. I wanted, just once, for someone to take care of you instead." Casey's shoulders began to shake. Rosie pulled her closer with what strength remained in her thin arms, and Casey folded herself against her mother's chest, careful, gentle, terrified of breaking her. "I am so proud of you," Rosie whispered into her daughter's hair. "Do you hear me? So proud. You survived things no kid should ever have to survive, and you did it with your head up. You found Tank. You trusted him. That took more courage than you know." "I was scared," Casey admitted, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "I know. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, baby, not being unafraid. Doing the brave thing even when you're terrified." Outside in the hallway, Tank stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching through the open door. Behind him, the hallway was lined with leather vests and folded arms, a dozen bikers standing silent and still, a wall of quiet strength. Through the window, more waited in the parking lot beside their bikes, chrome catching the afternoon sun. Inside the room, mother and daughter held each other and cried. Years of unspoken fear and love finally spilling out into the quiet hospice air. The days fell into a rhythm that Casey never thought she'd have. She worked the counter at Steel Horse in the mornings, sorting invoices and learning the names of parts from Bear, who explained things twice as slow as he needed to, just so she'd feel good about catching on. Then, when the afternoon light started slanting through the garage windows, Tank would wipe his hands on a shop rag and say the same thing every day. "You ready, kid?" And every day, Casey said yes. The drive to the hospice took 25 minutes. Tank's truck smelled like motor oil and coffee, and the radio stayed on low, some classic rock station that played the same 20 songs on rotation. At first, Casey kept her eyes on the window, watching the town blur into farmland, saying almost nothing. Tank didn't push. He'd learned over the weeks that some people needed quiet more than they needed questions. But little by little, the silence filled in with words. On Wednesday, Casey asked him what Rosie was like back when they were young. Tank kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his mouth pulled up. "Stubborn," he said. "Stubborn as a mule. She'd argue with me about anything just to see if I'd back down. Did you?" "Never once." He glanced at her. "That's probably why she liked me." Casey laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. It was the first time Tank had heard it, and he tucked the sound away somewhere private, like a photograph he wanted to keep. On Thursday, she asked him about the tattoo. He rolled up his sleeve at a red light and let her look at the wrench inked into his forearm, faded now but still sharp at the edges. "Got it the year I opened the shop," he said. "Rosie was there. She held my hand the whole time, even though I told her I didn't need her to." "Did you need her to?" Tank didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said finally. "I did." By Friday, Casey wasn't looking out the window anymore. She sat sideways in her seat, facing him, telling him about the engine she'd rebuilt that morning with Bear. How the timing belt had been worn clean through. How she'd figured it out before Bear even lifted the hood all the way. "You've got good hands," Tank told her. "Good instincts, too. That's not something you can teach." Casey looked down at her palms like she was seeing them for the first time. "My mom always said I got that from somewhere. She never said where." Tank's grip tightened slightly on the wheel, but he kept his voice even. "Guess some things just run in people." Each evening, they'd walk into Rosie's room together, and Rosie's face would light up the same way every time. Thinner and paler by the day, but still unmistakably happy to see them both. Casey would sit on the edge of the bed and tell her mother about the shop, about Dottie's terrible jokes, about the burger cookout Bear had thrown the week before. Rosie listened like every word was a gift. Tank stood by the window most nights, giving them their space, though sometimes Rosie would wave him closer and ask about the club, about business, about nothing important at all, just wanting him near. It became a routine. A fragile, precious routine that Casey let herself believe might last a while longer. Then came Tuesday. Tank was under a truck in Bay 2 when his phone buzzed against the concrete floor. He wiped his hands and answered it, expecting Bear or a parts supplier. Instead, it was a woman's voice, calm and careful in the way people get when they've delivered hard news 100 times before. "Mr. Morrison, this is Nurse Patterson from Willow Creek Hospice. I think you should come now." Rosie's taken a turn. "It's serious." Tank's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "How serious?" "I'd come now," the nurse said gently. "And bring Casey." He didn't remember hanging up. He didn't remember grabbing his keys or telling Bear to watch the shop. What he remembered, later, was running across the parking lot to his truck, his boots slapping the pavement, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. He pulled up outside Steel Horse and saw Casey through the front window, laughing at something Dottie had said, her hair tucked behind her ear, completely unaware. The second she looked up and saw his face through the glass, her smile disappeared. The drive to the hospice felt longer than it ever had before. Casey didn't say a word. She just stared out the window, her hands twisted together in her lap, knuckles white. Tank kept one hand on the wheel and reached over once to squeeze her shoulder. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He wasn't going to lie to her. Not now. When they walked into Rosie's room, the lights were dim. A nurse stood near the window, checking a monitor, her face calm but careful. Rosie lay in the bed, smaller than she'd looked even a few days before. Her eyes were closed, but they opened slowly when she heard the door. "There she is," Rosie whispered, her voice thin as paper. "There's my girl." Casey rushed to the bedside and took her mother's hand. Tank moved to the other side, quiet as a shadow, and did the same. "I'm here, Mom," Casey said. "I'm right here." Rosie's lips curved into a small smile. "I know, baby, I know." The nurse gave them a soft nod and stepped out, leaving the three of them alone in the hush of the room. The only sounds were the quiet beep of the monitor and the slow rhythm of Rosie's breathing. Hours passed like that. Casey held one hand, Tank held the other, and Rosie drifted in and out, sometimes murmuring things that didn't quite make sense, sometimes opening her eyes to look at them both like she was trying to memorize their faces. "Tank," she said once, somewhere past midnight. "Take care of her." "I will," he said. His voice cracked on the words, I promise you, Rosie, I will. I know, she said again. That's why I sent her to you. Casey wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand. She didn't let go of her mother's fingers, not even for a second. The night stretched on. The room grew colder, the shadows longer. A nurse came in twice to check things, adjust the blankets, murmur something gentle before slipping back out. Tank didn't move from his chair. His legs ached. His back was stiff. But he didn't care. He wasn't going anywhere. Somewhere around 3 a.m, Rosie's breathing changed. It got quieter. Slower, Casey looked up at Tank, panic flashing across her face. Is she? She's still here, Tank said softly. She's still here, Casey. Rosie's eyes fluttered open one more time. She looked at Casey first, then at Tank, and there was something so peaceful in her face that it didn't feel like fear in the room anymore. It felt like something else, something quieter. Thank you, she whispered. Nobody was sure who she was talking to. Maybe both of them. Casey leaned down and pressed her forehead gently against her mother's hand. I love you, Mom, she said. I love you so much. Love you too, baby, Rosie breathed. Always, her eyes closed again. Her chest rose, fell, rose again, slower each time. Tank held her other hand tight, his thumb brushing over her knuckles the way he used to all those years ago, back when things were simpler, back before everything got complicated and broken and lost. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. He just stayed there, holding on, the way he should have all those years before. The room grew still. The monitor's beeping slowed, then flattened into one long, quiet tone. The nurse came in without being called, like she somehow knew. She checked the machine, then gently pressed 2 fingers to Rosie's wrist. She looked up at Tank and Casey with soft, sad eyes. She's gone, the nurse said quietly. I'm so sorry. She's passed. Casey didn't move. She just stared at her mother's face. Still peaceful, still soft, like she was only sleeping. Tank sat frozen in his chair, Rosie's hand still warm in his. The weight of the silence pressing down on the room like something physical. Outside the window, the first gray light of morning was just beginning to touch the sky. Nobody spoke. The only sound left in the room was the quiet hush of stillness, heavy and complete. The morning of the funeral came gray and soft, with clouds hanging low over the town like they were carrying their own kind of grief. Tank stood in front of the small mirror in his bedroom, buttoning a clean white shirt he hadn't worn in years. His hands felt clumsy on the buttons. He kept thinking about Rosie's face those last few hours, how peaceful she looked, how her hand had gone soft and still in his. Downstairs, the shop had been transformed. Bear and Dottie had been up since 5 a.m, moving folding chairs into neat rows in the side lot, setting out programs Dottie had printed at the library with a photo of Rosie from years back. Smiling. Young. Full of life. Bear had called in favors from 3 towns over to get flowers delivered on short notice. Dottie had cooked enough food to feed 50 people, though she kept saying it wasn't enough, that Rosie deserved more, that nothing they did would ever be enough. Casey sat on the old couch in the spare room, still wearing yesterday's clothes. She hadn't said much since the hospice. Her eyes were dry now, but they had a hollow look to them, like someone who had cried so much there was nothing left to cry with. Tank sat down next to her. Careful, like she might break. You don't have to talk, he said. But we gotta go soon. Casey nodded, but she didn't move. Tank waited. He'd learned that much these past weeks, that sometimes the kindest thing was just waiting. I don't have anything black, she finally said, her voice flat. Dottie's got something for you. She laid it out already. Casey looked at him then. Really looked at him, like she was trying to figure out how a man built like a mountain could sound so gentle. She didn't say anything else. She got up and went to find the dress. The service was small, just like Rosie would have wanted, though she never got the chance to want anything about it out loud. A few old co-workers came, a woman from the diner where Rosie used to waitress, an Aunt Casey barely remembered. But mostly it was the club. Rows of leather vests and solemn faces. Men who looked like they could tear a door off its hinges standing quiet and still, heads bowed, out of respect for a woman most of them had never even met until her name showed up on a folded note in a scared girl's hand. Bear gave a short eulogy, his big voice cracking in places he probably didn't expect it to. He talked about loyalty, about how Rosie trusted Tank with the most important thing in her life, and how that trust said more about her character than words ever could. Dottie stood beside Casey the whole time, one hand resting on her shoulder, steady as a post. Tank didn't speak. He didn't think he could. He just stood beside Casey, feeling the weight of every one of these years pressing down on his chest, wishing he'd found Rosie sooner, wishing things had gone different a long time ago. Then it was time. They walked to the graveside together, the whole chapter falling into a line behind them, boots crunching over the damp grass. The casket sat above the open earth, covered in white flowers Bear had insisted on, said Rosie always liked flowers, though nobody quite remembered how he knew that. The preacher said his words, short and plain. Then the casket began to lower, slow, creaking, the ropes sliding through the workers' gloved hands. Casey's fingers found Tank's arm and gripped it hard, like she was afraid of falling if she let go. Her whole body was shaking now, quiet sobs breaking through the numbness she'd been wearing like armor all morning. Tank stood still, letting her hold on, watching the casket disappear into the ground, the last thread connecting her to the mother she'd known her whole life. The whole chapter stood silent behind them, a wall of leather and steel. Nobody moving, nobody speaking, just standing witness. Casey turned her face up to him, eyes red and wet, voice barely more than a whisper. "What happens to me now?" Tank looked down at her, and for the first time in a long while, he had no answer at all. The days after the funeral moved slow and gray, like fog that wouldn't burn off. The shop still opened every morning, the bikes still rolled in and out. But something had gone quiet in Casey, and Tank felt it like a hand pressing on his chest every time he looked at her. She stopped coming out to the front counter. She stopped teaching Dottie how to post pictures on her phone. She sat in the back room for hours, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. When Bear tried to coax her out with the promise of a burger off the grill, she shook her head and said she wasn't hungry. That happened 3 days in a row. Tank told himself it was grief. Grief did that to people. He'd seen it before, back when brothers in the club had lost parents, lost wives, lost each other on bad stretches of highway. Grief made you small, made you quiet. It would pass, he told himself, given time. But there was something else in Casey's eyes that grief alone didn't explain. Fear, a cold, sharp fear that lived just behind her stare, like an animal watching the tree line for something it knew was coming. He caught pieces of it when she didn't know he was listening. Late one afternoon, he heard her talking to Dottie in a hushed voice near the parts shelves. "They're going to come for me," Casey said. "Once they find out she's really gone. Once the state finds out there's no family." "Honey, Tank's not going to let anybody. He's not my family," Casey said, and her voice cracked down the middle like dry wood. "Not really. Not on paper. That's what matters to them. Paper," Dottie tried to argue, but Casey had already walked away, back straight, arms wrapped tight around herself like she was holding her own ribs together. Tank stood in the doorway of the office, a wrench still in his hand, and felt something twist low in his gut. She wasn't wrong. He'd looked into it, quietly, the day after the funeral. A few calls to a lawyer friend of Bear's, the truth sat heavy and simple. He had no legal claim to Casey, no custody, no guardianship, nothing but a note from a dead woman and a promise he intended to keep with everything he had, which meant nothing to a courtroom or a caseworker with a clipboard. He told himself he had time. He told himself he'd figure it out. He was wrong about the time. It was past midnight when he walked past the spare room and saw the light still on under the door. He almost kept walking. Almost told himself she just couldn't sleep, same as him most nights lately. But something made him stop. Something made him knock once, then push the door open without waiting for an answer. Casey stood in the middle of the room, the duffel bag open on the bed. Her clothes were folded inside, stacked the same careful way they'd been stacked the morning he'd found her behind the shop. She froze when she saw him, one shirt still clutched in her hands, her eyes wide and caught, like a kid who'd been found sneaking out a window. "Casey." His voice came out low. Careful, she didn't answer right away. She looked down at the bag, then back up at him, and her chin trembled even as she tried to hold it steady. "I figured I'd go before they came for me," she said. "Easier that way. For everybody. Nobody's coming for you." He said it fast, firm, but even as the words left his mouth he heard how thin they sounded. "You don't know that." Her voice cracked wide open now, no more holding it together. "You don't have papers, Tank. You're not my dad. You're just some guy my mom knew a long time ago. The second somebody official finds out there's no family, they're gonna put me in the system. I've heard about the system. I'm not doing that. I'd rather just disappear." Tank crossed the room and sat down slow on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. He reached out and gently took the shirt from her hands, set it down, and took both her hands in his, rough and steady against her shaking fingers. "Look at me," he said. She did, eyes wet and scared. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. Not while I'm breathing. You hear me? I don't care what it takes. Lawyers, paperwork, fighting the whole state if I have to. You're not going anywhere." Casey searched his face, wanting so badly to believe him. And Tank sat there holding her hands, sounding sure, feeling anything but. His mind racing through everything he didn't have. No legal claim, no guarantee, nothing but a promise he had no idea how he was going to keep. The storage place sat off Route 9, a long row of orange metal doors baking in the morning sun. Tank parked his bike in the gravel lot and sat there for a minute, just looking at the number on the paper Dottie had printed for him. Unit 114. He hadn't slept much. After he'd found Casey with her bag packed, after he'd promised her things he didn't know how to keep, He'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, running numbers in his head like a man trying to solve a math problem with half the pieces missing. Custody, guardianship, foster care. Words he didn't understand, words that scared him more than any bar fight or bad debt ever had. But today, he had a job to do. Something simple and physical, and he was grateful for it. Rosie's landlord had called the shop 2 days ago, said the storage unit rent was overdue, and somebody needed to come clean it out or they'd auction the contents. Tank had told Bear he'd handle it. Better him than Casey. She didn't need to be the one going through her mother's things. Not yet. Not while the grief was still so raw it bled at the edges. He unlocked the padlock and rolled the door up. It groaned on its tracks, loud in the quiet morning, and dust floated in the shaft of light that spilled into the small space. There wasn't much. That was the thing that got him first, before anything else. A woman's whole life, folded into maybe a dozen boxes, and a couple of black trash bags. A second-hand armchair with a blanket still draped over the back like she'd just stepped away from it. A few boxes marked kitchen and Casey baby stuff, and clothes in Rosie's careful, slanted handwriting. Tank stood in the doorway for a long moment before he made himself walk in. He started with the clothes. He folded sweaters he didn't recognize, a coat with a torn pocket, a pair of boots worn soft at the heel. He found himself moving slow, careful, like he was afraid of waking something up. Every item felt like a piece of a woman he used to know, a woman who used to laugh with her whole body and burn every batch of cornbread she ever tried to make. The photographs came next. He found them in a shoebox, loose, not in any order. Rosie young, laughing on the back of somebody's motorcycle. Rosie pregnant, hand on her belly, squinting into the sun. A few of Casey as a baby, then a toddler, then a gap-toothed kid holding up a fish nearly as big as she was. Tank's chest ached looking at them. All those years he hadn't known existed, all those birthdays and school pictures and ordinary Tuesdays he'd missed without even knowing there was anything to miss. He set the shoebox aside carefully, like it was made of glass. The last box was the heaviest, full of paperwork. Old bills, a lease agreement, a folder of medical papers that Tank made himself skim rather than read closely, still too raw for details. Near the bottom, his fingers brushed something different. Stiffer, an envelope. He pulled it out and turned it over. His name was on the front. Just Tank, written in Rosie's handwriting, the same slanted letters from the boxes, the same hand that used to leave him notes on the dashboard of his truck 15 years ago. Under his name, smaller, like an afterthought that wasn't really an afterthought at all, read this after. Tank's whole body went still. He sat down right there on the concrete floor of the storage unit. Boxes half sorted around him, dust motes drifting in the light from the open door. He turned the envelope over in his hands. Once, twice. It was sealed tight. The flap pressed down hard like she'd wanted to make sure it stayed shut until the right moment. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed that until now. Hadn't noticed how bad. How his fingers trembled around the edges of the paper like they belonged to somebody else. After what? He thought. After she was gone. That was what she meant. She'd known, sitting somewhere writing this, that there would come a day when she wasn't around anymore, and Tank would be holding this envelope instead of holding her hand. He stared at his name in her handwriting, and he did not open it. Tank's hands shook so bad he almost dropped his phone twice before he got the call to go through. Bear. His voice came out rough, like gravel dragged over concrete. I need you. Bear didn't ask questions. That was the thing about Bear. 15 years of riding together, and the man knew when a question would only slow things down. "Where you at?" "Storage place off Route 9. Unit 114. Give me 10 minutes. Tank sat down right there, on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit. Boxes of Rosie's life stacked around him like walls of a room he didn't want to be in. He held the envelope in both hands like it might fall apart if he wasn't careful. His name was on the front. Just his name, in Rosie's round, careful handwriting, the same handwriting from the note Casey had carried in her jacket pocket for a week straight. "Read this after." After what, exactly? After she was gone? After he'd already lost her twice, once to his own stubborn pride and once to a disease that didn't care about second chances? He didn't open it. He just sat there, staring at his own name until the letters stopped looking like letters. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Then he heard the rumble of Bear's bike easing into the gravel lot outside, the engine cutting off, boots on pavement. Bear ducked through the half-open rolling door of the unit, his big frame filling up the space, and when he saw Tank sitting on the floor like that, something in his face went soft and careful. "Hey." Bear lowered himself down next to Tank, knees popping, and didn't say anything else. He just sat there. Solid. Present. "I don't know if I can do this alone," Tank said. "You don't have to." Bear nodded at the envelope. "Whenever you're ready." Tank ran his thumb under the flap. The paper tore soft, like it had been sealed a long time ago, and he pulled out 2 folded pages covered front and back in Rosie's handwriting. His eyes stung before he even read the first word. "Tank, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry for so much more than that. There's something I should have told you 16 years ago, and I let fear win instead of doing the right thing. I need you to know it wasn't because I didn't trust you. It was because I trusted you too much, and I was scared of what that meant. Casey is your daughter, Tank. Yours and mine. She was born 8 months after we split, and I never told you because you were building your whole life around the club, and I didn't want to be the reason you gave any of that up. I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was protecting myself too, from watching you choose between us and them." Tank's breath caught somewhere in his chest and stopped moving. Bear had leaned in without asking, reading over his shoulder, and Tank felt the big man go still beside him. "I raised her the best I could. She's got your jaw, your hands, that same stubborn look you get when you've made up your mind about something. She loves engines the way you do, and I used to watch her take apart the toaster just to see how it worked, and think, there he is. There's her father, right there in her. I should have told you both a long time ago. I was going to, before I got sick, and then I was too scared, and then it was too late to do it the easy way. So I did it the only way I had left. I sent her to you, because I knew, whatever else happened, you'd take care of her. I knew you'd love her even before you knew why. Take care of our girl Tank. Tell her I loved her every single day. And tell her the truth. She deserves that much. Love always." Rosie Tank sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands, the words blurring and doubling as his eyes filled. 16 years. 16 years he'd had a daughter, and never known it. The girl sleeping in his spare room right now. The girl with grease under her fingernails and his same stubborn set to her chin. The girl he'd already started loving like his own without knowing she was. Bear sat back slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, his own eyes wet. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The storage unit was silent except for Tank's ragged breathing. Finally, Bear put a heavy hand on Tank's shoulder. "You gotta tell her, brother." The letter sat folded in Tank's shirt pocket, right over his heart, the whole drive back to the shop. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than he needed to. His mind kept replaying the same 6 words over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. "Casey is your daughter, Tank." He almost missed the turn into the lot. The sun was dipping low, throwing long orange light across the gravel, and that was when he saw her. Casey sat on the curb outside the shop, right where he'd found her that very first morning. Her duffel bag was packed again, sitting beside her feet like it had never been unpacked at all. Her shoulders were hunched forward, her arms wrapped around her knees, making herself small the way she used to before she'd started to trust anybody around here. Tank's chest ached at the sight of it. He parked the truck crooked, not caring, and climbed out. Gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward her. Casey heard him coming, but didn't look up right away. "Figured you'd send me off proper," she said quietly, her voice flat, guarded. "Guess with Mom gone, there's no reason for anybody to keep me around." "Casey, it's fine." She said it fast, like she'd practiced the words so they wouldn't hurt as much coming out. "I know how this works. Foster care, group homes, whatever. I've heard the stories. I'll figure it out." "Casey," Tank said again, firmer this time, and something in his voice made her finally look up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tired in a way no 16-year-old should ever look. She'd been crying, he could tell, even though she was trying hard to hide it behind a hard, flat stare. Tank lowered himself down onto the curb beside her, his knees popping as he sat, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The evening air smelled like motor oil and cut grass, the sound of Bear's radio drifting faintly from inside the shop. "I found something," Tank said finally. His voice was rough, thick A letter. "From your mom." Casey stiffened. "What kind of letter?" He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the folded paper, worn soft at the creases from being handled too many times already. His hand shook slightly as he held it out to her. "You should read it," he said. "It's about you. About us." Casey took it slowly, like it might burn her fingers. She unfolded it with care, the paper crinkling in the quiet evening air. Tank watched her eyes move across the lines, watched her face change as she read. Her hands started to shake. Rosie panicked. Rosie had written because she was scared of trapping you in a life you never chose. "But you deserve to know the truth now, Tank. Casey is yours. She's always been yours." Casey's breath caught. She read it again, her lips moving slightly as she mouthed the words, like she couldn't quite believe they were real the first time through. "This says..." Her voice cracked. She looked up at Tank, her eyes wide, disbelief swimming in them like she was drowning in it. "This says, you're my dad." Tank couldn't speak for a moment. His throat was too tight, his eyes burning. He just nodded, slow and certain. "Yeah," he managed finally. "I'm your dad, Casey." Something shifted in her face then. The disbelief cracked open, and underneath it was something raw and enormous, relief so big it looked like it might swallow her whole. Her hands were still shaking, the letter trembling between her fingers. "You're my dad," she whispered again, like she was testing the words, tasting them, making sure they were real. "I am," Tank said. "I always will be." Casey's face crumpled. tears spilling down her cheeks fast, and Tank didn't wait another second. He reached over and pulled her into his arms, fierce and tight, like he was never going to let go. She clutched at his jacket, burying her face against his chest, her whole body shaking with sobs that had been building for weeks, for years maybe, finally breaking free. Tank held her there on the curb, his own tears falling into her hair, the gravel lot around them fading into nothing but the two of them, father and daughter, finally found. The paperwork took over the kitchen table. Tank had never seen so many forms in his life. Custody forms, paternity forms, school enrollment forms. A stack of them, thick as a phone book, sitting next to his coffee mug every morning. "This one wants your social security number," Bear said, squinting at a form through a pair of reading glasses that looked tiny on his big face. "This one wants it again. Why do they need it 4 times?" "Government likes to make sure you mean it," Dottie said. She sat across from Bear with her own stack of papers, a highlighter in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. She had taken charge of the whole operation like she'd been born for it, color-coding forms by deadline, sticky notes everywhere. Tank sat at the head of the table, staring at a paternity test form. It felt strange, filling out paper to prove what he already knew in his gut. He'd known the second he read Rosie's letter. But the world needed proof. Ink and signatures and swabs of the inside of his cheek. "You doing okay?" Bear asked, not looking up from his form. "Yeah," Tank said. And then, quieter, "just want it done right. For her." Bear nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Word got around the club fast, the way word always did. And just like that, Steel Horse Auto Repair became command central for Operation Casey. One of the younger guys, a wiry kid named Pistol, who'd gone to community college for 2 years before dropping out to fix bikes, turned out to be good with computers. He found 3 family lawyers within 20 miles and printed out their reviews. Another biker, a quiet man named Duke, who nobody had ever heard say more than 10 words in a row, turned out to have a cousin who was a judge's clerk 2 counties over. He made a call. Things moved faster after that. Casey watched it all happen from the shop counter, doing her homework, looking up every few minutes like she couldn't quite believe it. "Why is everybody working so hard on this?" she asked Dottie one afternoon, watching Bear argue on the phone with someone about a filing fee. Dottie put down her highlighter and looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're family now, sweetheart, and family shows up." Casey looked down at her homework so Dottie wouldn't see her eyes get wet. But Dottie saw anyway. She always saw. She just didn't say anything, just squeezed Casey's shoulder and went back to her forms. The court date came on a gray Tuesday morning in October. Tank wore the only suit he owned, a dark blue one that hadn't seen daylight since a funeral 8 years back. It pulled tight across his shoulders. Casey wore a dress that Dottie had picked out, pale yellow with small flowers, and she kept tugging at the hem like it didn't feel like her own skin. The courtroom was small and plain, nothing like the movies. A judge with silver hair and reading glasses looked over the papers for what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes. Tank's hands sweated through the whole thing. Casey sat beside him, gripping the edge of her chair. Then, the judge looked up. "Congratulations, Miss Morrison," she said. "The court finds in favor of the petition. As of today, you are the legal father and guardian of Casey Reeves." That was it. No trumpets, no fireworks, just a stamp on a piece of paper and a judge moving on to her next case. But Casey grabbed Tank's arm so hard it left marks, and when he looked down at her, she was crying and laughing at the same time, and he understood then that some of the biggest moments in life happen quiet, in small rooms, with nobody clapping. Outside the courthouse, the whole chapter was waiting. 30 bikes lined up along the curb, chrome catching the gray light. When Tank and Casey came down the steps, the whole club erupted into cheers, horns honking, Bear lifting Casey clean off her feet in a hug that nearly cracked her ribs. That weekend, they moved her things. It didn't take long. Casey didn't own much, just the duffel bag she'd arrived with, and a few things Dottie had bought her since. But Tank had spent the week clearing out the spare room in his house, the one that had sat empty for years, filled with boxes and old tools. He'd painted the walls a soft blue, put up real curtains, bought a real bed with a real headboard. Casey stood in the doorway of her new room, the late afternoon sun coming through the window, and she set her duffel bag down on the bed like it was something precious. She unpacked slowly. A few shirts into the dresser drawers. Her mother's photograph on the nightstand. A small stuffed rabbit, worn soft from years of hugging, propped against the pillow. She looked around the room, really looked at it, the walls and the bed and the light coming through the curtains, and she smiled, tears running down her face at the same time. The garage smelled like charcoal smoke and motor oil, which Casey had decided was the best smell in the whole world. Silver streamers hung between the motorcycle lifts, twisting slow in the breeze from the open bay doors. Someone, probably Dottie, had taped a hand-painted banner across the tool wall. It said "Happy Birthday, Casey" in big crooked letters, with a tiny wrench drawn next to her name. Bear stood at the grill in the corner of the lot, wearing an apron that said "Kiss the Cook" over his leather vest. Smoke curled up around him as he flipped burgers with a spatula that looked tiny in his huge hand. 2 more minutes, he called out. Anybody touches these patties before I say so gets banned from the club forever. You can't ban people from their own birthday party, Bear, Casey said, laughing. Watch me. Folding tables had been dragged out and covered with checkered cloths. Bags of chips sat next to bowls of potato salad Dottie had made from her grandmother's recipe. Bikers Casey had grown to know over the last few months milled around, laughing, telling stories, some of them holding paper plates piled high with food. Someone had hooked up a speaker to a truck battery, and old rock songs played low in the background. Casey sat at the head of one of the tables, wearing a birthday crown someone had made out of bent wire and bottle caps. It was ridiculous. She loved it. 16 candles flickered on top of a lopsided cake that Dottie had baked herself, chocolate with white frosting. Casey written across the top in blue icing that had run a little in the heat. "Make a wish, kid," Bear said, setting the last plate of burgers down on the table. Casey looked around at all of them. Bear, with his big grin. Dottie standing behind him, hands folded, eyes already a little wet. A dozen other members of the chapter, men and women who had been strangers to her 4 months ago and now felt like aunts and uncles. And Tank, standing near the edge of the group, arms crossed, watching her with that quiet look he got sometimes, like he was trying to memorize her face. She didn't need to wish for anything. She already had everything she needed. But she closed her eyes anyway, out of habit, and thought of her mother. She thought Rosie would have liked this. The noise, the leather, the burnt burgers. All of it. She opened her eyes and blew out the candles in one breath. The whole garage erupted in cheers and whistles. someone banging a wrench against a metal toolbox like a bell. All right, Casey said, laughing, waving her hands. I have an announcement. The garage quieted down, curious. She stood up from the table and rolled up her sleeve, slow, building the moment the way she'd seen Bear do 100 times when he told a good story. There, on the inside of her forearm, was a small fresh tattoo. A tiny wrench, simple black lines, still a little red around the edges from the needle. I got Marcus to do it last week, she said, nodding toward one of the younger members who did tattoo work on the side. Told him I wanted to match somebody. She looked over at Tank. For a second, nobody said anything. Then Bear let out a whoop that could have shaken the rafters, and the whole garage broke into noise, clapping and cheering, someone letting out a long whistle. Dottie pressed both hands over her mouth, eyes shining. Tank didn't say anything at first. He just walked over, slow, and looked down at her arm, at the small wrench that matched the one on his own forearm. The one Rosie had told her to look for all those months ago on a piece of paper that Casey had kept folded in her pocket for a week while she slept behind the shop with nowhere else to go. He thought about Rosie then, the way she used to laugh with her whole body, the way she'd looked at him in the hospice with something like relief in her tired eyes, like she'd known all along this was how it would end up. He felt her there in that moment, in the noise and the smoke and the streamers, like she was standing just behind him with her arms crossed, watching too. "Happy birthday, kid," Tonk said, his voice rough. Casey came looking for a stranger with a note in her hand. She'd found a father, a family, and a home that ran 300 motorcycles deep. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.